talk a little bit about this sampling risk. Sampling risk arises from the possibility that when a test of controls or a substantive test is restricted to a sample, the auditor's conclusions may be different from the conclusions he or she would have reached if the tests were applied to the whole population. That's sampling risk. We're just running through definitions, running through these concepts of sampling risk, allowance for sampling risk, all of these definitions. That is, a particular sample may contain proportionally more or less monetary misstatements or deviations than the population. So for a sample of a specific design, sampling risk varies inversely with sample size. And this actually makes sense, right? So sampling risk is the risk that your population is going to be different than your sample. So if you test more, your sample size increases. That means your sample size is getting closer to the population, thus your sampling risk will go down. Your population is 100 transactions, and you only test one of them, sampling risk is going to be high. But then if we test 99 instead, well, that's much closer to the whole population, so sampling risk will go down. So inversely related. The smaller the sample size, the greater the sampling risk. We only test one item out of 100, that's going to be a much higher sampling risk than if we tested 50, 75, 99, anything like that. Assessing that good old sampling risk. Well, the auditor should apply professional judgment. Shocker. We're using professional judgment a good amount throughout this exam. In assessing sampling risk, in performing substantive tests of details, also known as tests of details, substantive testing, same thing there, drilling that home. The auditor is concerned with two aspects of sampling risk. Now, here are some things you want to memorize. You want to be concerned with the risk of incorrect acceptance and incorrect rejection. These are two risks, and let's talk through the definitions of them. Incorrect acceptance is the risk that the sample supports the conclusion that the recorded account balance is not materially misstated when it is. So incorrect acceptance is you saying, hey, it's good, but it's not. In reality, it's not. Whether you know that or not, well, if you know that, you probably will fix it, but a lot of times you say, hey, it's good, but it's not good. So memorize that. The risk of incorrect acceptance is the risk that your sampling says you're good, but no, there actually is a material mistake. The risk of incorrect rejection is the risk that the sample supports the conclusion that the recorded account balance is materially misstated when it's not. So it's the opposite. Incorrect rejection says, hey, yeah, there's a problem. But in reality, there's no problem. There's no material mistake. Two definitions, two risk types, I would definitely have memorized there. Next, the auditor is also concerned with two aspects of sampling risk in performing tests of controls. We see here, this is test of controls. Here we're talking about substantive test of details. Samplings used. Well, what about the risk of assessing control risk too low? So the risk of assessing control risk too low is the risk that the assessed level of control risk based on the sample is less than the true operating effectiveness. So the risk of assessing this control risk too low is saying, oh, control risk isn't too high, right? Like it's not too scary. They probably have solid internal controls. Well, you test it, you sample it. But in reality, it's actually the opposite. So we assess it too low. The sample is less than the true operating effectiveness of the control, so that's a problem because we've said the risk is, let's say, 1%, but in reality, it's 5%, and 5% is much more significant than 1%. Now, the risk of assessing control risk too high, that's the risk that the assessed level of control risk based on the sample is greater than the true operating effectiveness. Now, I'd say this is less of a problem, right? The problem of assessing it too low is a problem because you're going to say that, okay, we thought it was actually, not a big deal, but it is a big deal. But this is still a problem. Your goal is to try to get it as accurate as possible. And if you assess it too high, you may do much more work than is necessary. And we're going to talk about the concept of efficiency and effectiveness when we are sampling and doing these items and testing and procedures. Efficiency and effectiveness, super important. So effectiveness is how effective are you actually catching everything? And efficiency is, are you doing too much work? Because as an audit, we've talked about a bunch of times, you've got limited resources, limited personnel, limited time, limited funds, limited money, limited budget to conduct the audit. Definitely memorize all of these good points here. Talk a little bit about non-sampling risk. We talk about sampling risk. Well, non-sampling risk includes all the aspects of audit risk that are not due to sampling. So everything else. Which we saw before where we see that sampling risk plus non-sampling risk is just overall risk. An auditor may apply a procedure to all transactions or balances and still fail to detect a material misstatement. Non-sampling risk includes the possibility of selecting audit procedures that are not appropriate. So it doesn't have to do with the sample. It has to do with that you did the wrong procedures, right? You just did the procedures wrong, something like that. So, for example, confirming recorded receivables cannot be relied on to reveal unrecorded receivables. If you chose a process that's not going to reveal something else, that's a problem. Specifically here, if we are sending out confirmations, well, confirmations we can only send out based on the receivables we see. But if there are receivables that should have been recorded but are not, well, we don't see them written down. We don't see them written down. So as such, we can't send confirmations. So that would be insufficient procedure, which would fall under non-sampling risk. Non-sampling risk also arises because the auditor may fail to recognize misstatements included in documents that he or she examines, which would make that procedure ineffective, even if he or she were to examine all items. So again, it has nothing to do with the sample. It has to do with everything else. Non-sampling risk can be reduced to a negligible level through factors such as planning and proper conduct. Really just risks that we talk about in other lessons, other sections, fraud risk, procedural risk, all of these risks that just don't fall under the umbrella of sampling risk. Because if there's just a problem, maybe you could sample perfectly, but if you don't have all the documents you need, so if you don't have a total population, that's non-sampling risk. Let's dive into these risks again, looking at them, talk about the relationships, adding some more on to what we've already seen, and making sure you got this, because I want you to earn free points of the exam. I don't want you to have to work too hard for those points. Let's make sure you understand this so you can go along with a smile on your face. We see these 4 risks, and I want to assign something to them. We have these concepts of effectiveness and efficiency. Now, the risk of assessing control risk too high, we're going to say that this goes along with the efficiency of an audit. And since both efficiency and effectiveness start off with EFF, can't really do that. So I'm going to say efficiency is EY. These two are efficiency. And what is efficiency? Well, during an audit, yes, we want to get the right answer. We want to get the right opinion. We want to do the proper work. However, we're not magical. We don't have magical powers. We got to get it done within physical constraints. We have a limited budget. We have a limited time period. We have due dates. And how are we going to work within those constraints? We're going to be efficient. Efficiency means you're going to get your audit done within budget. You're not going to go down pitfalls. You're not going to miss things. That's efficiency. Effectiveness, and I'll call this ES, effectiveness has to do with, are you going to get the right opinion? That's a gross oversimplification, and we will see the nuances of them in these descriptions. But yeah, so efficiency is how efficient you get the audit done, not to use the word in the definition, but are you going to get it done without excess issues? And then the effectiveness of an audit is, are you going to get the right opinion? So the risk of assessing control risk too high, this has to do with the efficiency. Because here we're saying we assessed the risk too high, the risk, control risk, which we know from audit risk. It's a component of audit risk there. It's the risk that internal controls will not do their job and control internally. Like having fun here. I hope you guys are having fun as well. Of course you are. You're spending time with me. Now, this is the risk of assessing control risk too high. On the left here, I'm going to put what we assessed it at. Let's say we assessed it at 5% issues, but in reality, it only has 1% of issues. Now, if it was me, I have a lot of issues, but that's just me. I don't know about you. The risk of assessing control risk too high is the risk that the sample indicates a greater error rate than actually exists in the population. Now, that's not a problem with getting an opinion. If we think about that, right? Because if you it's kind of like doing more work. You assessed a higher problem rate, so you're going to do more work, and then you're eventually going to find out, oh, sorry, it actually wasn't 5%, it was 1%. So that's not a problem in terms of giving a wrong opinion. That's a problem in terms of efficiency and not getting your work done on time. Not that I would know anything about that. I get my work done on time all the time. So, for example, in this case, based on the selected sample, the auditor believes that this control is not operating effectively, but in fact, in this case, appropriate credit approvals are being obtained. So In this case, it's actually working properly. Now, let's go to the risk of incorrect rejection because I want to do the efficiency ones first. The risk of incorrect rejection is the risk that a sample mistakenly indicates a material misstatement when, in fact, the balance is fairly stated. So let's say we think there's a problem, and since I don't want to do this with percentages, I'm going to say, here's my crude drawing of a fire. So this is fire. It's a wonderful drawing. So we think there's a fire, which represents a material misstatement, but in reality, check. It's all good. Now, this isn't a problem in terms of giving a wrong opinion because what's going to happen? Well, we're going to go investigate the fire, find out that it actually isn't a fire, and, well, we're good to go. But if you could have determined that there was no material misstatement to begin with, you wouldn't have spent, let's say, an extra 20 hours investigating it, thus making the audit less efficient. We are just as concerned about the efficiency of the audit as we are with the effectiveness, which is giving the right opinion. We talked about this. In this case, the auditor erroneously assumes based on the sample that, let's say, dividend income is materially understated. In other words, the auditor will mistakenly reject a properly stated balance when they should have accepted it. But again, you will catch it eventually because you need to investigate all material misstatements. It's just going to make the audit slower, big more problems for you. Now let's talk about the effectiveness, right? This is important. These are both equally important. But here is where you could have a real big problem is if you give the wrong opinion. In this case, the auditor has mistakenly assumed that invoices throughout the year are not approved when in fact this control was not operating during the last 3 quarters of the year. So we assume that it was fine, but in reality, the control is not operating properly. So mistakenly assumed that invoices were not approved. That is presumably the correct option. What should have been going on, it rejected these invoices because they were invalid. So the sample was not representative of the population, and therefore the auditor will make an erroneous decision. So here, it's the opposite. We're saying, oh yeah, no, everything's fine. It's rejecting invoices that were not approved. So our control risk is low. It's 1%. But in reality, we didn't detect the issue, and in reality, it's 5%. So here's where you could run into the effectiveness issue when in reality you have a problem, but you didn't pick it up. So we see here how that's different than efficiency. Lastly, we're going to move over to the risk of incorrect acceptance. This risk of incorrect acceptance is the risk that a sample mistakenly indicates an account balance is fairly stated when in fact it's materially misstated. That's a problem. So what happens here? We thought, hey, we're all good, but in reality, we have a nice little dumpster fire going on. That's a problem, and we may have missed it, which has to do with our effectiveness. We are not effective as auditors. Our goal here is to make you effective auditors. Follow a course, and you'll get there. Let's talk more specifically about that effectiveness. So this is going to talk more about what we talked about, the effectiveness, risks to effectiveness in sampling. This involves, and I want you to memorize, the risk of incorrect acceptance. And right, you got to memorize some things. It is what it is. It sucks, but it'll be 3 points in the exam if you memorize this. And the risk of assessing control risk too low, these are related to effectiveness in detecting an existing material misstatement. And here, just drilling it home. If you've got this all memorized, you can probably skip this slide in the next one. But I want to drill this home, make sure there is not a single space of doubt in your mind. The risk of incorrect acceptance refers to the chance the auditor will not detect a material misstatement if one exists. The risk increases when auditors do not properly assess the level of control risk. Again, you're doing tests of controls to test them to see if they're functioning properly. If they are not, then you adjust your control risk assessment. But here, we don't assess it properly. When an auditor assesses control risk too low, it means he or she is underestimating the risk that the client's internal controls will not prevent or detect a material misstatement. Wrapping up here, if the auditor does not adequately assess the level of control risk, it's a problem. They may accept financial information without properly verifying its accuracy. Another problem. This could lead to the auditor not detecting any existing material misstatement, which has to do with effectiveness. Therefore, it's important for auditors to accurately assess control risk, no duh, in order to reduce the risk of incorrect acceptance and ensure that any existing material misstatement is detected. Just do your job. Do your job right. Make sure you catch any errors. That's what we're looking for here. Surprise, surprise, we're at efficiency. We're talking about efficiency in sampling. We want to memorize that the risk of incorrect rejection and the risk of assessing controllers too high relate to efficiency. If you had unlimited resources and all the time in the world, sure, doesn't matter, not a big deal. But I don't know. If I were me, I'd want to be done with the audit sooner so I could go sit on the beach with a margarita. But maybe you enjoy doing the audit. All power to you. The risk of incorrect rejection is the risk that the auditor incorrectly concludes that there's a problem when there's no problem. This could lead to the auditor recommending unnecessary changes or additional testing, which takes time, energy, effort. And who likes to give effort? I don't like to give effort. I like to relax. To the client, that could increase the cost of the audit. That's a problem. We want to keep that cost down. The risk of assessing controllers too high is the risk that the auditor incorrectly assumes that the client's internal controls are effective when they are not. This might result in the auditor failing to perform necessary tests or procedures to ensure that the financial information is accurate and complete. It can also lead to the auditor not identifying potential misstatements that could have a significant impact on the financial statements. All having to do with efficiency. Are we doing this properly? Both of these risks can have a negative impact on the efficiency of the audit as they increase the amount of time and resources needed to complete it. We want to use less time. We want to use less resources so we can use them for maybe the next audit. Earn a little more money from our next audit client. Here are some examples just to drill these home. We're going to go through. We've got some examples of the risk of incorrect rejection, which could be incorrectly concluding that an account balance is materially misstated, an asset is not properly recorded when it is, transactions not properly authorized, or that there's an inadequate system of internal control, when in reality, all these things are fine. The following here, we have examples of the risk of incorrect acceptance. So the sample supports the conclusion that the recorded account balance is not materially misstated when it is. So that's a problem because we missed the problem. And we got to detect these problems so we can give a proper opinion. Concluding that an account balance was fairly presented when it was not. Again, that sounds like quite an issue to me. And failing to detect a material misstatement in an account, well, that's your whole job. Make sure that the financial statements are free from material misstatement. Not doing your job, and that's a problem. Hey there! Are you ready to not only pass your CPA exams, but truly understand and enjoy the material while studying? I know it seems impossible, right? Especially to enjoy the material? We'll do it together. Tap into the power of CPA.examprep.ai, where we've got personalized quizzes, multiple choice questions, memorization guides, flashcards, simulations, all tailored to your learning. Our adaptive study planning puts you on the fastest path to success and lifts you back up if you fall behind. Avoid wasting your precious time and money attempting an exam with a low chance of passing, because who wants that? We want to get you through this process as quick as possible. Our exam readiness prediction lets you walk in with confidence, knowing that you're prepared for success on exam day. Thankfully, there's no payment method needed to get started, so why don't you come join us? Visit cpa.examprep.ai and let's achieve your exam success together.